We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapters 4 and 5. Had to kind of dice this up a little bit because there's a lot of things going on in these two chapters. And I didn't want to keep you too long, and I didn't want to cut it in half and try to do it in two sessions. So we're going to talk mainly about how people view God and things surrounding God, holy things. If you talk to people who are not really connected very well with the church or with spiritual things, and you try to talk to them about God, they have all kinds of amazing ideas about who God is and what they expect from God and what they think God expects from them. There are just about as many opinions as there are people. But what I want us to talk about tonight is two main groups of folks, the Israelites and the Philistines. They were at war. If you remember the last time we looked at any particular enemy of Israel, it was Samson fighting against the Philistines. Right? Killed a lot of Philistines in his life, and we're told killed more in his death than he killed in his life. So Samson was a great warrior against the Philistines. Well, this is several years later, but the Philistines are still a very powerful nation living over on the coast of the Mediterranean, and they are one of Israel's biggest ongoing problems. And as we start in chapter 4, Philistia and Israel are at war again, and Philistia has the upper hand and have had for quite a period of time by the time we get to this. So let's just read the first three verses, and that'll give us kind of a precursor to the things that are going on. Samuel's word came to all of Israel. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hands of our enemies." Right? The first question is a legitimate question. There were times in Israel's history when they lost battles, and they came to find out that the reason they lost the battle was somebody had done something, and there was sin in the camp. Think, for instance, after the Battle of Jericho, Achan takes some of the things that were supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, hides them in his tent. Then when they go up against this little bitty town of Ai, they get beat, and they come back asking the Lord, well, what is it that we've done? The difference in the two accounts is that in Jericho and Ai, they asked the Lord, and the Lord gave them an answer. In this account, when they lose to Philistia, they just make up their own minds what they think will fix the problem. What they think will fix the problem is to take the Ark of the Covenant from where it is in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and take it with them into the battle. So they're going to force God to be with them by taking God's box into the battlefield with them. Now, you and I know that there's something not quite right about that thinking, right? It would not occur to us that that would be the right way to go. But that's what they were thinking. If we take the Ark of the Covenant with us, then God has to go with us because that's where God lives. He is enthroned between the cherubim. That's his spot on the planet. So if we take his spot on the planet to the battlefield, then God has to go along with them, and they will be successful. All right? Let's keep reading in verse 4, and we'll see how the Philistines viewed God. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. When the Ark of the Lord's Covenant came into the camp, all of Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" Now, there's two or three things going on here that I think are really cool. Because the ark comes, then the priests of God have to come along with the ark. So they don't just get God in the box, they get Hophni and Phinehas as a door prize to come with them. And then when they get to the camp of Israel, Israel is so convinced that God is going to be on their side because they've brought the Ark of the Covenant to camp, that they start shouting. And the shout is so loud that the Philistines notice. The Hebrews are all excited because something big is happening in the camp of the Hebrews. When they learned that the camp of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck down the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So they have to have a pep talk in their camp because all of the folks in Philistia are thinking along the same lines as the folks in the Hebrew camp. If they've got a god, or did you notice the plural there? Gods in the camp with them, then we're toast. We've never gone against a god before. We've only fought against people. So they're afraid. Well, their commanding officers, I'm assuming, give them this rousing speech and say, well, if you don't go beat them, you're going to be subject to them. We've had them kind of as our vassals for the last who knows how many years. And if we let them win, then they're going to be lording it over us for the next. So we've got to go to battle. We've got to make sure that we don't allow their gods to defeat us, whatever that means. It's interesting that they knew about Egypt, that these were the gods that brought the plagues on Egypt. But again, what are they assuming is the god? That box, right? They brought the ark into camp because when God put the plagues on Egypt, where was the Ark of the Covenant? Just in God's mind, right? It had not yet been built. They don't build the Ark of the Covenant until they escape Egypt and get all the way to Mount Sinai. So there's no God in a box in Egypt. God, in all of his power, brings the plagues on Egypt. And then they later make this Ark of the Covenant, and God takes up residence, so to speak, in the Holy of Holies once they have the box in that place. Right? They go back to battle, and the Philistines win round 2. When they win this battle, they not only defeat Israel, but they capture the Ark of the Covenant. They kill the priests who were the priests of these gods that they were so afraid of. So Hophni and Phinehas get killed in the battle. And a young man from the tribe of Benjamin. Don't we keep running into Benjamin a lot? The young man from the tribe of Benjamin runs back to make sure that the home crowd knows what's going on. So he goes back to Shiloh where Eli is. Eli is a very old man, and he is leaning in his chair up against the wall. And when the young man comes in and tells him what has happened, Eli topples off of his chair and breaks his neck. So in the course of this day, the Ark of the Covenant has been captured by the enemy. Hophni and Phinehas, the two main priests at Shiloh, have been killed in battle. And Eli, the main priest, the head of the clan of the priests at Shiloh, has died by falling off of his chair. But that's not the end of it. Phinehas's wife was very pregnant. When she hears the news that her husband has died, she goes into labor. Her labor is so intense that she dies. When she dies, they name the child Ichabod. Okay? Now, you and I that have read The Headless Horseman, that's where our minds immediately go. But Ichabod means the glory has left. Right? So it's the old, at the end of an Elvis concert, and people would still be yelling and screaming for more, what would they say? Elvis has left the building. That's exactly what the Israelites were thinking. They've got the Ark of the Covenant. Now all the glory is gone. Right? God in a box has been taken behind enemy lines, and we've got nothing else that we can do about it. So the leadership of Israel is either dead or in mourning, and they name the child Ichabod. The glory is gone. Go over to Jeremiah 3. We need to have a little bit of an answer for this before we move on. Jeremiah chapter 3. We're going to read starting in verse 14. God knew, I assume he knew, even when he had them build the ark, that human beings would have trouble with the concept of this Ark of the Covenant and him meeting with them between the cherubim. But he left the Ark of the Covenant in circulation all the way up until probably the time that the southern tribes were taken into Babylonian captivity. That's about as far as we can trace the history of it. But chapter 3, beginning in verse 14, he says, "Return, you faithless people, declares the Lord. I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town, two from a clan, and I will bring you back to Zion. Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding. In those days, when your numbers have increased greatly in the land, declares the Lord, people will no longer say, 'The ark of the covenant of the Lord.' It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all the nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. No longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts." So God says there's going to come a time when the idea of the Ark of the Covenant is not going to be so important to you anymore. So even the children of Israel eventually would kind of let that go. These days, the Ark of the Covenant is an important archaeological question. Does it still exist? If it does, where is it? Does it have any importance to modern Judaism? All those kinds of questions that come up. And of course, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a good movie. So we've all come across something that has to do with the Ark of the Covenant. But as far as our relationship with the Lord, is it something that you think about? Is it something that's necessary to your connection to the Lord? No, the Lord is enthroned in our hearts. The Spirit is here with us. So we don't need a representative box with the cherubim anymore. There's a different relationship that God wants to have with his people. Right? When we get into chapter 5, we get a quick treatment of what happens to the Philistines after they take the Ark of the Covenant home with them. It is a tremendous coup for them that they have stolen the Ark. And they're as proud of it as they can be. So they take it to the one place that they think is the best resting place for the God of Israel that they're carrying around in this box. They take it to the Temple of Dagon. This is one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture, and particularly in the Old Testament. They take God in the box, and they put him in Dagon's temple. When they come back the next morning, Dagon has fallen over on his face in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, again, they don't have God captive. God's not just in the box, right? But God is doing stuff. And he makes Dagon bow down to him, which is really cool. They set Dagon back up. When they come back the next morning, Dagon has fallen over again, and his head and his hands have come off. Okay, that should be your first really good hint that you made a mistake taking the Ark of the Covenant. But the head and the hands end up on the threshold into the temple. If your God falls over and his head and his hands come off, get a new God. Okay? That would be my advice for these people. This is not what these people do. These people come up with a new rule. And the new rule is, don't step on the threshold. It's a holy place. So when they would come into their temple, they would leap over the threshold so that they wouldn't defame their God who had fallen over and lost his head in his hands. So that's the level that we're dealing with. There is another passage, and I didn't take the time to look it up, but the Philistines are described as those who leap over the threshold. The Israelites are told that they're not to intermarry with, they're not to give their sons and daughters in marriage to, they're not to socialize and be connected to those that jump over the threshold. So it just kind of became a sideways insult to the Philistines. So it's been the Temple of Dagon was there in Ashdod. They had 3 different capital cities. They were a very large group of people and kind of clannish. So the men of Ashdod come down with tumors. Okay? And if you want to read a commentary on the subject, it will tell you more about the tumors, but I won't. But they were not pleasant tumors. They were unhappy. And so they decided what they needed to do was get rid of the Ark of the Covenant. We don't want God here anymore because he's bringing plagues on us. So they take the Ark of God and they take it to the next capital city, to Gath. And when they get the Ark to Gath, the exact same thing starts happening to all the men of Gath. So there are men dying. There are men who have very uncomfortable tumors because the ark is there. Gath says what we really need to do is send this thing to Ekron. So they send it to the other capital. They send it to Ekron. And I just want to read to you chapter 5, starting in verse 10. Chapter 5 and verse 10. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, "They have brought the ark of the God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people." Death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy on it. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. So the Israelite army was not so strong. The Israelite leadership was not making great decisions about how to go about fighting the Philistines. But the Philistines fought against themselves, because when they took the Ark of the Covenant, they took something that was very precious to the God of heaven, something that only belonged in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle at Shiloh. And so everywhere they went with that Ark of the Covenant, God brought pestilence on them. And they finally just decided the best thing that they could possibly do would be get rid of the Ark of the Covenant. And so, Lord willing, we'll pick up with how that took place. It's really a long, drawn-out story that happens over the course of several books of the Bible, not just several verses. But they've got to come up with a way to get rid of something that they thought was the best thing they could have ever captured. And they get pretty ingenious with the way they handle the situation to get rid of the God in the box that they had brought to Ashdod. Any questions, thoughts about any of that? Okay. If there's a way that we can help you by way of a public response, we would love to do that as we stand and sing.